Have you ever imagined a silent night suddenly turning into a living hell in the blink of an eye? When American soldiers first set foot in the Dachau coal yard, they did not encounter armed foes, but instead found stacked corpses, choked screams piercing the smoke-filled air of the ovens, and a horror so extreme that even the toughest troops trembled. That scene, a nightmare woven with the stench of decay, was the most tragic face of war, where power was inverted at the very moment of liberation. In today's video, we will step inside that death factory to uncover the bloody tales of revenge and the dirty hands decisions of those newly freed. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss these dark corners of history. And let us know which city you're watching from. Spring of 1945, when the war's iron-shod march seemed spent. Allied soldiers pressed through the rusted gates of the concentration camps. They crossed the threshold without warning, and in an instant, the world outside turned into a nightmare. Before them stood not armed foes, but a death's beehive, crematoria still smoldering. Smoke coiling overhead, corpses heaped in mounds, and desiccated flesh exuding a suffocating stench. Many soldiers froze, hearts pounding, mouths parched, unable to voice the long-cherished prayers for peace. In the pale dawn light, Helmes bremel low, they struggled to suppress the haunting image of trembling hands, once squeezing triggers in the trenches, now forced to confront victims, driven to the brink of existence by endless days and nights. Some shivered uncontrollably, tears stinging their eyes from a deep guilt for surviving, while so many had been annihilated before their very gaze. Every breath they drew was laden with collective anguish, and within it flared an indescribable fury. Before they could compose themselves, they discovered stores of human hair, sets of teeth, and children's garments, relics of a civilization plunged into utter madness. The scene, surpassing any notion of conventional warfare, bent even veteran soldiers under the weight of psychological trauma. Their hands shook as they gripped the barracks doors, torn between rushing forward to cradle those seemingly lifeless bodies and turning to flee from a reality too horrific to face. General Eisenhower, fully aware of the evidentiary power of photographs, film, and first-hand testimony, immediately ordered exhaustive documentation, but in each soldier's heart echoed the same anguished question: what are we to do with these people? The laws of war had never been designed to comprehend genocide. Yet the human heart throbbed wildly, craving swift retribution to ease the pain and reclaim a shred of dignity that had been violently stripped away. And it was within this precarious legal void, rife with doubt, that a torrent of conflicting emotions, from the jubilation of liberation and outrage at the atrocities to confusion over the choices before them, drove these men to a fateful crossroads: punishment or mercy. Those hasty decisions and blood-stained acts of vengeance stand as vivid proof that, in the very moment of liberation, both liberators and the liberated were swept into the maelstrom of chaotic justice, where emotion and morality converged in a suffocating climax. At Dachau camp, the 7th Armored Division advanced from multiple directions, and the soldiers, one by one, came upon a freight train carrying more than 2,000 fallen angels, many corpses still fresh, faces frozen in their final moment of disbelief. The scene felt like stepping into the netherworld. Survivors, skeletal and spent, many weighing under 40 kilograms, unable to stand, dragging themselves inch by inch toward the Allied troops. Their minds reeled at the sight of bodies torn apart, as if the souls had not yet departed the wreckage of flesh. Amid that desolation, 3 Swiss Red Cross workers raised a white flag, signaling formal surrender. 2 SS officers followed, hastily laying down their arms, but not granted the status of ordinary prisoners. Confronted with those who had mercilessly slaughtered their fellow human beings, many soldiers felt the boundary between military discipline and a consuming rage dissolve instantly. Some froze in stunned silence, hearts pounding as though they would burst, eyes reddened by a storm of anger and pity. Before they could collect themselves, they moved on to the coal yard, a vast stockpile supplying the camp's power generators and heating system. There, about 50 former SS soldiers were assembled, wrists still bound by white armbands, faces ashen and hollow. With the command temporarily withdrawn to establish defensive positions, a gap opened that some troops could not resist exploiting. In less than a heartbeat, machine guns rumbled to life, and the ex-SS men fell coldly to the ground. Despite having surrendered, though the initial excuse was that they attempted to flee, later investigations confirm no such attempt. These executions sprang purely from the deep outrage ignited by the atrocities just witnessed. The corpses strewn along the coal yard wall, hands still uplifted in surrender, became grim entries in internal reports, labeled a test of conscience in those first chaotic hours of liberation. Never could they have imagined that, between tears, laughter, and fury, they themselves would pull the trigger on men who had so brazenly usurped the right to life. Emotions surged, half craving the catharsis of vengeance through cold steel and lead, half questioning whether this was justice or mere revenge. The hush before the volley, the soldiers' haunted gazes flickering between wrath and horror, etched indelibly the tragic reality that wartime law had never foreseen. And in that moment of unbridled fury, the chaotic justice of liberation was forever stamped on the memory of all who bore witness. The moment the gunfire in the coal yard finally subsided, the storm of chaotic justice swept through the camp. At the railway station, 4 former German soldiers tried to conceal themselves in a freight car loaded with corpses, hoping to evade the Allied troops' search. Yet an American officer, still burning with rage, raised his Colt and squeezed the trigger without hesitation. Each of the 4 collapsed instantly. Soldiers then poured in, searching and executing any survivors with no sign of mercy. In that instant, the laws of war seemed to vanish before the fury that had built up over countless days of witnessing atrocity. Back in the camp's center, American officers immediately sorted prisoners by rank. The Wehrmacht troops were separated. While SS men were confined to a restricted area, those who had once guarded the gates of death were forced to stand in rigid lines, backs pressed against the concave wall behind the barbed wire. A few attempted to flee, only to have their ribs shattered by crowbars. Others were strangled with bedsheets until their breathing ceased. The scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood hung in the barrack doorways, indelibly seared into the memories of those who witnessed it. Not content with firearms alone, some soldiers handed crude clubs and shovels to former prisoners, an indirect form of collaboration in the mass executions. They placed rudimentary weapons into the hands of men newly liberated from bondage, allowing the victims themselves to determine the fate of their tormentors, as if to partially assuage the months of pent-up fury. The echoes of screams, the crack of blows, and the groans of the dying reverberated across the camp, from afternoon well into dusk. The death toll on liberation's first day fluctuated wildly. Internal reports recorded between 30 and 50 fatalities, though many eyewitnesses claimed it reached into the hundreds. Among the hardest hit were the Kapo's prisoners appointed by the SS to brutalize their fellow inmates. Some were dragged into the central yard, hoisted onto warehouse beams, and beaten to death with iron rods. Others were led into shadowed corners and silenced in the night, their cries unheard. As night fell, the camp lay in temporary chaos. The gunshots ceased. Dust and smoke settled, and only the acrid stench of decay remained. By day's end, regular troops returned to re-establish discipline and order, taking control of strewn weapons and the piles of bodies. Yet the memory of that fateful afternoon when power was reversed and rage overrode, reason would haunt all who witnessed the chaotic justice unleashed the moment the camp doors opened to freedom. Amid the surrounding chaos, a wave of spontaneous justice quickly ignited among the prisoners. Political detainees and a handful of clandestine leaders accustomed to seals and documents took it upon themselves to gather evidence, scars, the remnants of lashes on flesh, and trembling testimonies of survivors. They established mobile people's courts within the barrack area, where a makeshift table became the judge's bench. Trials moved swiftly. The accused were hanged by shredded collars or lined up to be shot by guards, with others whipped until their final breath. The air reeked of decay and gunpowder. Yet the survivors' eyes blazed with fierce conviction, however rudimentary. This verdict was the justice they had longed for. At Buchenwald, an internal resistance network had prepared lists of capos and SS officers responsible for brutalizing fellow inmates. When the American forces quietly advanced, those who had been recording every detail sprang into action. In mere days, they seized control of the camp, tracking down the most vicious perpetrators, sealing off cells, and handing down pre-hootered drafted sentences. The lone crack of the execution echoed like thunder, casting judgment on cruelty pushed to its limit. Less than a week later, regular troops restored order. But the reverberations of that trial continued to haunt the barrack corridors. Meanwhile, at Bergenhof, Belsen, the British Army prioritized medical relief to stave off epidemic, which somewhat tempered outright violence. Rather than firing bullets, they compelled SS men to carry corpses to mass graves. Without protective gear, more than 20 fell ill and died, regarded as a form of medical punishment in full view. Though this sanitary measure did not involve firearms, few could hold back tears at the sight of men who once wielded life and death, now shoveling earth over their victims. Yet when night fell, under the lax watch of the British patrols, shadows slipped from the tents to exact vengeance on capos and informers in silence. They were dragged into dark corners of the warehouses, dispatched by cold blades or strangled with ropes. No official report acknowledged these hidden purges, but the trembling hands of later storytellers still bear witness to those secret executions. In the darkness of that night of liberation, the thirst to restore dignity and to instill fear back into the oppressors gave rise to a chaotic justice full of contradictions where justice and vengeance intertwined. So that the moment freedom arrived, it had already been paid for with the very hearts of those who had longed for it. At the camps, liberated by the Soviet Red Army, the flames of vengeance burned more fiercely than ever. At Majdanek in Poland, the Soviet authorities organized a public purge. Local militias and former prisoners were encouraged to identify notorious guards. Those named were brought to the central square and hanged in full view as a deterrent to any who might contemplate repeating such atrocities. Meanwhile, at Sachsenhausen, the thunder of Red Army loudspeakers rang out before regular tribunals could arrive, clearing the way for inmates to unleash their fury on the very men who had tortured them. Old ropes and barbed chains became instruments of punishment. The bodies of the guards fell lifeless in the dying light, marking the opening salvo of uncompromising reckoning. Farther east in Ukraine, at Yanovska, a Soviet regiment took things even further. Dozens of captured SS soldiers were handed directly to the prisoners with the chilling order, "These are yours to judge?" Bedaume, not one of them remained alive. Though the methods varied, public or clandestine, bullet or noose, all these reprisals shared a profound logic, restoring the humanity that had been stripped away, shattering the cruel power structures that had redefined them. Meanwhile, the Allied armies, confronted with a humanitarian crisis and the threat of epidemic, largely chose to look the other way or record events only vaguely in their reports, citing the urgent priority of saving lives. Many senior officers, exemplified by General Patton, reviewed the investigation files and decided not to pursue charges. They committed crimes so monstrous they cannot be endured. That decision and the excision of these events from official history created a vast silence. Later generations would know liberation's triumphant horns, but remain unaware of the chaotic justice that surged the moment freedom's gates first opened. Once the initial thirst for vengeance had abated, the United States Army set about gathering evidence of the executions carried out against prisoners who had already surrendered. An internal report by a major documented severe violations of the Geneva Conventions, noting that American soldiers had used firearms, batons, and other crude weapons to kill men who had laid down their arms. A series of junior officers was recommended for courts-martial, but when the investigation file reached General Patton, the military governor of the Bavaria region, all charges were abruptly dismissed. He declared, "These men are not ordinary soldiers, but genocidal criminals, and therefore not subject to the usual rules of warfare." This rationale exposed a profound conflict between the existing legal framework and the moral intuition provoked by inhuman crimes, giving rise to a tacit policy that allowed for temporary retribution in parallel with the decision not to prosecute. Military procedures were swiftly revised to serve immediate priorities: the distribution of food and medical supplies, the establishment of orderly humanitarian relief, and the preservation of film, photographs, and witness affidavits. For future international tribunals, the covert executions from random shootings to fatal beatings were omitted from official records. When questioned, many commanders cited insufficient personnel to intervene, or prioritizing care for survivors to obscure the fact that they had chosen silence, or even encouraged soldiers to let the victims mete out justice to those brutal oppressors. As a result, most estimates of post-surrender fatalities existed only in classified files or in the harrowing testimonies of surviving witnesses. It was not until many decades later, when secret documents were declassified and veterans finally spoke out, that the public learned of that hidden chapter of nameless deaths, of bullets fired, deliberately or by impulse, and of unspoken vows of silence weighed down by remorse. Ironically, new directives for liberated camps etched a chilling maxim into the military psyche: when confronted with crimes against humanity, the rules may be set aside, but history cannot be forgotten. That paradox endured long after the Great War receded into memory, leaving a bitter legacy, even in moments of victory and liberation. The choice between justice and vengeance haunted every soldier's soul like an inextinguishable ghost. Later, numerous scholars and philosophers have noted that the series of revenge actions in the liberated camps gave rise to the dirty hands problem. Soldiers, despite breaching international humanitarian principles, felt morally justified when confronting extreme crimes. Hannah Arendt observed that the Holocaust catastrophe exceeded the capacity of traditional law to address, and that only new laws crafted by the victims themselves could match the sheer magnitude of that evil. Michael Walzer argued that, in the most extreme circumstances, an individual conscience may temporarily set aside conventional rules in order to restore some measure of justice for those who have endured torture. Most of those who took part in the reprisals carried an enduring moral stain. They acknowledged violating the laws of war, but asserted that the extraordinary circumstances left them no alternative. It was the tragedy of a broken spirit striving to uphold human dignity while also seeking to punish those who had stripped it away. Later studies have characterized this mindset as an extreme survival response. After months or years of sustained brutality, the direct execution of one's oppressors was seen as a way to break free from the haunting power of the cruelty they had suffered. It was precisely this internal conflict, the clash between the drive for vengeance and the voice of conscience, that continued to haunt many veterans in their later years. They asked themselves, were those actions truly justice, or merely the personal release of pent-up rage? This question has become a central theme in research on collective and individual behavior in the face of mass atrocity, demonstrating that when human beings are pushed to their limits, the boundary between good and evil, between justice and revenge, becomes so blurred that it resists any easy resolution. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, the official military dispatches made scant reference to the summary executions that followed surrender. Likewise, the International Committee of the Red Cross, stationed at many camps, focused exclusively on medical assistance and compiling humanitarian statistics. Any mention of retaliatory killings survived only in classified correspondence or in the private journals of individual soldiers, only to be declassified decades later. During the height of the Cold War, Western news outlets preferred to project an unblemished image of humanitarian liberators, excising photographs of retribution from their archives to avoid tarnishing public perception. This deliberate curation of collective memory gave rise to what scholars have termed a zone of silence within Holocaust historiography. The most contradictory and unsettling episodes were relegated to the margins so that the Allies could be enshrined as faultless heroes. For nearly half a century, the narrative of liberation was streamlined into one of pure rescue and benevolence, with little acknowledgement of the chaotic, ad hoc justice that erupted behind camp gates. It was not until the closing decades of the 20th century that researchers, survivors' associations, and private archival projects began to unearth the suppressed records. Historians painstakingly sifted through field reports, internal telegrams, and veteran memoirs to reconstruct a more nuanced portrait of those pivotal days. Published works and documentary films revealed that liberation, though a moment of profound relief for the incarcerated, also marked the dawn of a turbulent, unofficial justice characterized by indiscriminate shootings, impromptu tribunals, and whispered executions under cover of darkness. As these revelations entered the public sphere, they prompted vigorous debate about the morality of extrajudicial retribution. Many questioned whether understanding such complexities diminished the moral clarity of the Allied cause, or, conversely, enriched it by acknowledging the full spectrum of human response to atrocity. Today, museum exhibits and educational programs strive to present both facets, the compassion shown to survivors and the shadowy episodes of revenge that immediately followed. Ultimately, the reemergence of these hidden stories serves as a reminder that history is never static. By bringing to light the dissonant events of liberation, the chaotic justice that accompanied freedom scholars and institutions have deepened our comprehension of the Holocaust's aftermath. In doing so, they ensure that future generations confront not only the horrors of genocide, but also the ethical ambiguities that confront those who survive and those who liberate under the most extreme circumstances. In recent years, scholarship has begun to recalibrate our understanding of liberation by incorporating the full range of post-liberation reprisals into the broader narrative of Holocaust aftermath. Authors such as Daniel Goldhagen, Robert Abzug, and Deborah Dwork have each devoted chapters to these spontaneous acts of revenge in their analyses of the camp's social and moral legacies. Their work emphasizes that liberation was not a singular moment of rescue, but a complex inversion of power, replete with both mercy and violence. Museum curators and memorial designers have taken note. Exhibitions at institutions like Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Imperial War Museum now include documents, photographs, and oral histories that acknowledge the darker side of freedom's dawn. Meanwhile, digital projects, most notably the Survivors' Testimony Archives and the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Collection, preserve first-hand accounts of quiet midnight killings, improvised public trials, and the anguished deliberations of those who had endured years of dehumanization. These survivor narratives reveal a startling diversity in methods of retribution. In some camps, former prisoners opened fire on their oppressors with captured weapons. In others, they resorted to crude tools from the barracks, shovels, hammers, makeshift clubs to execute those identified as the worst perpetrators. Public hangings drew furtive crowds in central courtyards, while secret executions in darkened corners of auxiliary buildings went unrecorded. Each mode of justice aimed to restore honor and agency to the victims. But the scale, organization, and brutality varied dramatically from one site to another. At Buchenwald, resistance committees planned lists in advance and facilitated more systematic tribunal procedures. In contrast, at smaller outlying camps, revenge often took the form of uncoordinated, particularly savage beatings carried out by groups of former prisoners acting on raw emotion. Sociologists and psychologists have since interpreted these acts as a form of last-ditch resistance, a desperate attempt to reclaim one's humanity after years of utter powerlessness. Scholars note that, for many survivors, the ability to confront and punish those who had tormented them was not an expression of sadism, but a cathartic assertion of selfhood. It provided a way to externalize pent-up rage and, in some eyes, to rebalance the moral ledger before the onset of more formal judicial processes. That said, historians stress that this rough justice coexisted uneasily with the emerging international legal framework that would culminate in the Nuremberg trials. The tension between these two forms of accountability, informal, emotional, and immediate versus formal, procedural, and delayed, remains a key theme in contemporary Holocaust studies, underscoring the profound ethical ambiguities that accompany the transition from oppression to liberation. Ultimately, The post-liberation reprisals defied clear categorization as either lawful or reasonable, yet they underscored an undeniable truth. When confronted with crimes of the most extreme magnitude, existing legal and ethical frameworks are often too slow or too rigid to offer an adequate response. The survivors' once helpless inmates suddenly found themselves vested, however briefly, with the power to punish their tormentors. In those fleeting hours, they ceased to be the oppressed and assumed the role of agents of justice. Wielding authority born of desperation and righteous fury, from a strictly legal perspective, such summary executions represented a violation of the very conventions that the liberating armies professed to uphold. The Hague and Geneva Conventions explicitly protect combatants who have laid down their arms, yet these rules had not anticipated the phenomenon of industrialized genocide. In the space between the collapse of Nazi control and the establishment of formal military government, the rule of law yielded to raw state, unmediated human impulses. Moral philosophers have long debated whether such actions can ever be justified. Deontologists would insist that killing unarmed prisoners is intrinsically wrong, regardless of context. Consequentialists, by contrast, might argue that immediate retribution provided significant psychological relief to survivors and helped deter any further acts of cruelty. However, no theoretical framework fully captures the complexity of those chaotic days. The victims, now empowered as perpetrators of reprisal, often viewed their actions not as illegitimate violence, but as an essential restoration of agency after enduring unimaginable dehumanization. They seized a momentary reversal of power to reclaim dignity and assert that their lives, once considered expendable, were in fact of supreme importance. Yet this pursuit of justice was fraught with moral peril. Many participants later testified to lasting feelings of guilt and uncertainty, haunted by questions of whether their deeds were acts of righteous vengeance or transgressions that perpetuated cycles of violence. Recognizing this duality of both a profound yearning for justice and the ethical missteps it engendered is crucial for a holistic understanding of the Holocaust's liberation phase. Sanitizing history to present a purely heroic narrative omits the very human struggle that followed the fall of tyranny, the struggle between mercy and wrath, order and anarchy, law and emotion. By acknowledging the moral ambiguities of those hours, historians and educators can offer a more authentic account of liberation, one that honors both the resilience of survivors and the daunting ethical questions they faced. In reflecting on these events, we are reminded that freedom's dawn is seldom neat. The aftermath of atrocity often demands immediate, imperfect responses. Confronting this reality does not diminish the achievement of liberation. Rather, it enriches our appreciation of its complexity and underscores the enduring lesson that even in moments of triumph, humanity must reckon with its most difficult choices. In the years following the end of the Second World War, as rifles fell silent and bayonets were sheathed, the harrowing episodes of immediate post-liberation revenge quietly faded from public discourse. Against the backdrop of the Cold War, Western media outlets were intent on promoting the image of humanitarian liberators, downplaying or entirely suppressing reports of American and British soldiers standing by as former SS guards and capos were beaten, shot, or strangled. Photographs documenting these acts of retaliatory violence were systematically purged from press archives, and the classified United States Army investigation, whose recommendations for courts-martial were discarded by General Patton, remained secret until its declassification in the early 1990s. This selective amnesia created what historians have termed a zone of silence in Holocaust historiography, a void where the most unsettling contradictions of liberation discipline, colliding with raw vengeance, were relegated to the margins. The International Committee of the Red Cross, whose personnel were present in many of the camps, focused exclusively on providing medical care, sanitation, and accurate counts of the living and the dead, deliberately omitting any reference to Allied troops, turning a blind eye to summary executions. Consequently, first-hand accounts of collective revenge survived only in fragmentary form, hidden within the private diaries and letters of individual soldiers, and in the off-the-record memoranda of aid workers. It was not until decades later, when researchers began to access declassified military documents and to conduct oral history interviews with aging veterans and survivors, that this suppressed chapter started to emerge. Personal testimonies, once confined to family scrapbooks and obscure archival collections, revealed a far more complex picture of liberation, one in which the triumph of freedom was inextricably entangled with acts of spontaneous and sometimes brutal retribution. Scholars uncovered letters describing midnight hangings in central courtyards, field reports noting unidentified former prisoners involved in unauthorized killings, and internal Red Cross correspondence lamenting an inevitable collapse of customary protocols. By bringing these hidden narratives into the light, historians have begun to dismantle the simplistic binary of liberator and victim. The process of integrating these revelations has been painstaking. Curators must decide which images to display. Educators must frame discussions around moral ambiguity. And communities must wrestle with the discomfort of acknowledging that acts of justice and vengeance often blurred together, far from diminishing the heroism of Allied forces. This fuller reckoning enriches our understanding of the Holocaust's aftermath, reminding us that the path from captivity to freedom was never neat, and that the human impulse for retribution can clash powerfully with our highest ideals. By the close of the 20th century, historians and researchers began to unearth the classified records and expose long-buried truths. In 1991, Major Joseph Whitaker's investigative report on the Dachau coal yard massacre was discovered in the United States National Archives, revealing that dozens of SS men had been shot after surrendering. Around the same time, internal correspondence from the International Committee of the Red Cross disclosed that military commanders had temporarily suspended the principles of the Geneva Conventions to prioritize saving lives. These revelations spurred scholars such as Robert Obzug to question the existence of an Allied secret policy tacitly permitting extrajudicial reprisals, thereby encouraging a more multifaceted approach to studying liberation. Unpublished field reports and the personal testimonies of former prisoners, preserved in collections like the USC Shoah Foundation archives, further illuminated the chaotic ethics of those early days. Memoirs described midnight hangings in the barrack courtyards, clandestine tribunals convened by survivors, and the anguished decisions of soldiers torn between duty and fury. This freshly uncovered evidence challenged the simplistic narratives that had long dominated public understanding, framing liberation not only as a moment of rescue, but also as a profound moral crucible. International conferences hosted by institutions such as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem became forums for debating the so-called ethical trial of liberation. Legal scholars, ethicists, and survivor scholars convened to reassess the frameworks governing soldierly conduct in extreme circumstances. Papers were presented on the tension between de jure obligations under international law and de facto imperatives born of confronting industrialized atrocity, workshops explored whether existing military codes could or should be adapted to address crimes that transcended conventional warfare. Importantly, none of this archival excavation aimed to excuse or justify the summary executions that had taken place. Rather, the goal was to clarify the razor-thin line between justice and vengeance, and to draw lessons for the future by documenting precisely when and how legal norms were circumvented. Researchers sought to inform modern peacekeeping and humanitarian operations, ensuring that armed forces today understand both the ethical pitfalls and the responsibilities they bear when entering zones of mass atrocity. The integration of these findings into educational curricula and museum exhibits has reshaped the way we talk about liberation. Visitors now encounter tablets displaying excerpts from Red Cross cables alongside photographs of liberation festivities, prompting reflection on the moral ambiguities inherent in seizing victory amid horror. University courses on military ethics have adopted case studies drawn from these declassified materials, training a new generation of officers to recognize the dangers of dirty hands when facing the unimaginable. Ultimately, the excavation of decades-old files underscores a vital truth. Confronting the full complexity of liberation is not an act of moral relativism, but a necessary step toward genuine accountability. By acknowledging both the triumphs of rescue and the darker impulses of retribution, we build a more honest historical memory and equip ourselves to prevent the next descent into such extremes. In the early 21st century, scholarship on post-liberation reprisals expanded considerably. Daniel Goldhagen deepened the analysis by framing direct victim resistance as a form of active endurance, arguing that survivors seized limited moments of power to assert agency. Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt emphasized the imperative of honoring the full spectrum of survivor experience, insisting that accounts of retributive justice be integrated alongside narratives of rescue. Holocaust museums around the world, from Washington, D.C. to Berlin to Jerusalem, began to incorporate materials documenting these initial revenge campaigns. Visitors now encounter detailed maps marking the locations where bodies were stored, archival photographs of warehouses brimming with captured weapons, and recorded testimonies describing improvised people's courts. Exhibitions often display original barracks, tools, shovels, hammers, lengths of rope used by former prisoners in summary proceedings against those who had tormented them. Innovative interactive displays have pushed these efforts further by employing virtual reality technology to recreate moments of confrontation. In one immersive installation, participants don VR headsets to witness the escorted procession of SS leaders through camp corridors. The simulation captures the visceral tension between a soldier's sworn duty to maintain order and the primal urge to enact vengeance. As users look on, they must choose whether to intervene or stand aside, prompting reflection on the profound ethical dilemma faced by actual liberators. These initiatives aim to immerse audiences in the complex reality of Liberation Day. Not only the jubilant cheers of newly freed inmates, but also the silent, blood-stained interludes that followed. By juxtaposing scenes of rescue with evidence of violent reprisals, museums acknowledge that freedom's dawn was accompanied by moral tumult. Artifacts rang with contradictory symbolism. A child's striped blanket displayed beside a spent cartridge, a glowing medical kit installed next to a crudely fashioned gallows. Through these multifaceted approaches, curators seek to honor survivors by validating their need for justice, however raw. At the same time, They challenge visitors to confront the uncomfortable truth that, in the wake of genocide, even noble ideals can be strained beyond recognition. Exhibitions conclude with interpretive panels drawn from survivor reflections, in which former prisoners express mixed emotions: relief at liberation, gratitude for rescue, guilt or regret for retaliatory acts. By weaving together academic research, material evidence, and immersive storytelling, these museums foster a more honest reckoning with the Holocaust's aftermath. They underscore that the story of liberation is neither purely heroic nor entirely tragic, but a tapestry of human responses to unimaginable evil. In doing so, they ensure that future generations grasp not only the magnitude of atrocity, but also the profound moral complexity embedded in the moment of liberation itself. In addition to institutional accounts, the story of post-liberation revenge comes vividly alive through individual testimonies. In his memoir, Writing for My Life, Jorge Semprún recounts the moment when former prisoners forced SS guards to assemble in the coal yard at Buchenwald. He describes their tumultuous cries of "keep discipline" as they battled the instinct to avenge every hour of torment. This raw recollection captures the whirlwind of emotion. Decades of seething hatred compressed into the split-second decision to shoot or spare one's former tormentor. Similarly, in First Light, Rabbi Herschel Schachter provides an intimate portrait of Dachau's coal yard. He details the tremor in his own hand as he raised a rifle, torn between military oath and the anguished longing to punish. His narrative underscores the breadth of survivor sentiment, from the relentless psychological scars etched by daily cruelty to the desperate surge of moral clarity that demanded immediate reckoning. The reader is drawn into the soldier's heart, the force to confront the stark option between mercy and retribution. Primo Levi's pioneering concept of the gray zone deepens our understanding of these moments. He suggested that extreme suffering can blur the line between victim and perpetrator, creating moral ambiguities that defy conventional judgments. Levi's framework helps explain why survivors who wielded power briefly to administer justice often felt both vindicated and irrevocably stained. Their actions, though aimed at restoring agency, bore the weight of ethical conflict, an indelible testament to human complexity in extremis at survivor-led symposia. These personal narratives form the core of collective reflection. Former inmates share how embodying the role of executioner offered a fleeting respite from helplessness, yet also inaugurated a new burden of guilt. They speak of sleepless nights haunted by the faces they fired upon, of dreams in which the hanged rose again to confront them. Through these conversations, survivors assert that full acknowledgement of their wartime experiences, including acts of revenge, is essential for genuine psychological recovery. By foregrounding individual voices, historians and educators underscore that no single narrative can capture the entirety of liberation's aftermath. The interplay of memoirs, philosophical inquiry, and communal dialogue reveals a tapestry woven from both deliverance and reprisal, recognizing the totality of survivor experience, joy, and vengeance. Moral clarity and dirty hands constitutes the first step toward honoring their full humanity. In doing so, we ensure that the memory of liberation remains not a sanitized triumph, but a rich, if painful, affirmation of the resilience and complexity of the human spirit. Looking back over 15 sections, the portrait of post-liberation vengeance at the concentration camps emerges as a profoundly conflicted chapter in human history. Liberation was undeniably an act of deliverance, yet it also marked an abrupt inversion of power, in which those once dehumanized seized the authority to punish their oppressors. From the coal yard at Dachau to the improvised people's tribunals at Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Sachsenhausen. These revenge actions transcended the boundaries of existing laws of war, creating a zone of silence in Holocaust historiography that long obscured their full scope. Acknowledging this chaotic justice does not detract from the moral imperative to condemn genocide. On the contrary, it illuminates the profound ethical agony faced by both victims and liberators. Survivors who executed, beat, or dragged capos and SS guards to makeshift gallows did so out of an urgent need to reclaim dignity and agency. Yet they also carried the burden of actions that violated the very conventions meant to safeguard human life. Thus, the paradox of these events lies in their simultaneous assertion of justice and transgression of legal and moral norms. The ultimate lesson of this tumultuous period is the necessity for more adaptable legal frameworks that can confront mass atrocity without leaving a blank expanse where moral and judicial guidance should reside. Humanitarian relief and criminal prosecutions are indispensable, but they must be complemented by mechanisms that address the raw immediacy of survivor, justice mechanisms rooted in deep respect for human dignity and the harsh realities of extreme suffering. Only through integrating medical, legal, and ethical responses can the international community ensure that victims are afforded genuine recourse, rather than forced into extrajudicial avenues that perpetuate cycles of violence. In practical terms, this means developing protocols for armed forces and aid organizations entering atrocity zones, rapid victim identification, secure custody of surrendering perpetrators, and immediate deployment of neutral tribunals where basic due process safeguards apply. Training programs for military and peacekeeping personnel must incorporate case studies of dirty hands scenarios, teaching officers how to balance instinctive demands for retribution with the enduring standards of international law. Memorials and educational curricula should likewise present both the heroism of liberation and the moral ambiguity of subsequent reprisals, fostering a nuanced public understanding that avoids simplistic binaries by confronting the full complexity of those fateful days where rescue and revenge, mercy and wrath, law and emotion collided. We honor the memory of survivors in their entirety. We also commit ourselves to a future in which the revelation of hidden truths strengthens rather than diminishes. Our dedication to justice, in that commitment, lies the hope that the next generation will face the unspeakable with not only compassion and resolve, but also with legal and ethical clarity that extends into every shadowed corner of history.